Wait Till Helen Comes, a ghost story by Mary Downing Han. Chapter 4. While Mom was still out on the porch, Dave came into the kitchen. Ruffling his hair with one hand, he sighed. "Well, Heather's asleep," he said, "so you two can get along to bed now yourselves. Don't wake her up, Molly. I've just about run out of little princess stories." As Michael and I started to leave the room, Dave asked where Mom was. "On the porch, having a cup of tea," I said, as I followed Michael down the hall. Behind me, I heard the screen door open and shut, and then Dave's voice murmuring something to Mom. Pausing in his doorway, Michael said, "Want to come in and talk for a while, Molly?" "Sure. I'm not in any hurry to go in there and take the chance of waking her up." Michael's room already looked like home. His framed insect displays were hanging on the wall over his bed, his aquarium was set up near the window, and his scientific apparatus, microscope, magnifying glass, butterfly net, and chemistry set, was in place on the long desk Dave had made for him. Books filled his shelves, mostly plant, bird, rock, and animal nature guides, with a few Encyclopedia Browns, Hardy Boys, and Alfred Hitchcocks for variety. Picking up one of his fossils, I examined the print of a tiny skeleton embedded in its surface. "Doesn't the graveyard bother you at all?" I asked. "I think it's great," he said. "I'm going to make it into an archaeological project. I'll study all the graves and then figure out what the people died of." "You don't mean you're going to dig them up?" I stared at him, horrified. "Of course not. That's against the law. What do you think I am? A body snatcher?" Michael grinned and polished his glasses on his t-shirt. "Not that it wouldn't interest me. In fact, I wish I could. They dig up Indian burial grounds and primitive Iron Age people, and they learn a lot from the strange things buried with him." "That's awful." I thought of all the movies I'd seen on TV involving the opening of pyramids and the curses of mummies. I'd be scared to disturb somebody's bones. I shuddered just thinking about how horrible it would be to discover a skeleton. "You really are scared of the graveyard, aren't you?" Michael sounded curious. "There's something about it, Michael." I gazed past his curly head at the window's dark rectangle, thinking of the tombstones behind the hedge, the tall weeds silvery in the starlight. It seemed to me that they waited there in the night for something, and I folded my arms tightly across my chest and tried to convince myself that I was being silly. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Michael leaned toward me. All he needed was a pipe in his mouth to make him the perfect scientist. I shrugged. "I don't know." As usual, his rational approach was embarrassing me. I felt silly answering his questions. Pretending to yawn, I edged towards the door. "I think I'll go to bed, Michael." He nodded. "If you hear any funny noises or see a face at the window, just yell for me," he said as I started down the hall to Heather's and my room. I glared at him, sure now that I wouldn't be able to sleep for fear of what might be creeping toward the church from the graveyard. "Just kidding, Molly," he whispered as I paused, my hand on my doorknob. "The only weird thing you'll see tonight is Heather." Ignoring him, I tiptoed into the room. Except for the moonlight shining dimly through the window, it was dark, and I moved cautiously, not wanting to trip over anything and risk waking Heather. Pulling my pajamas out from under my pillow, I undressed and got into bed. I was anxious to fall asleep as quickly as possible, so I wouldn't lie there thinking about horror stories and scary stories. But you know how it is. The more you want to sleep, the more you stay awake. Hearing every strange sound and translating it into footsteps in the hall, bony hands at the windows, the moans of ghosts in the shrubbery. When I heard a sort of whimper, I stiffened in terror and prepared myself for the appearance of a hideous creature. Forcing myself at last to open my eyes, I saw nothing but Heather, her pale face almost hidden in her dark curls tumbling over the pillow. As I watched, she moaned again and tossed restlessly, mumbling something that sounded like, Mommy, Mommy. Turning my back, I grabbed my cassette player and put the earphones on. Soon all I heard was the voice of Julie Harris reading one of Emily Dickinson's poems, a good inspiration for the poetry I plan to write this summer. I woke up to the sound of mower droning away outside. The sun was shining, and Heather's bed was empty. Glancing at my watch, I saw that it was 9 o'clock. Hoping that Michael hadn't already disappeared in a quest of new insects to add to his collection, I dressed and ran down the hall to the kitchen. I found Heather and Mom sitting at the table, finishing their breakfast. Dave was already in the carriage house, setting up his pottery workshop, and Mom said Michael was in the graveyard talking to Mr. Simmons. "Who's Mr. Simmons?" I asked, pouring milk on my cereal. "He's the graveyard's caretaker. He comes once a month or so to mow the grass and tidy the place up." Mom sipped her coffee. "He's a nice old chap, about 70 or 80 years old, but he carries himself like a soldier." Remembering the height of the weeds, I had a feeling that Mr. Simmons had been on a vacation or something. "Maybe it won't look so gloomy after he finishes," I said. Mom smiled and turned to Heather. "What would you like to do today, sweetie?" she asked. Shoving her half-full bowl of cereal across the table, Heather got up and headed toward the back door. "Where are you going?" Mom called after her. The only answer she got was the sound of the screen door banging shut behind Heather. "Oh, well, I guess she'll be all right outside." Mom went to the window over the sink and watched Heather amble across the lawn toward the hedge and the sound of the mower. "Poor Mr. Simmons. I guess she wants to see what he's up to." She crossed the room and paused beside me. "I've got a lot to do today, Molly, and as soon as you finish eating, please go out and keep an eye on Heather. I don't want her wandering off." "Can't I stay in and help you?" She patted my shoulder. "The nicest thing you can do for me is to look after Heather." Before I could say anything more, she left the room. Glumly, I ate the rest of my cereal and went outside in search of Heather and Michael. By the time I got to the graveyard, Mr. Simons had finished mowing. He was clipping and trimming the weeds around the tombstones, and Michael was raking the cut grass into a pile next to the wheelbarrow. Heather was sitting on a fallen tombstone, trying clumsily to make a daisy chain. When she saw me hesitating at the gate, she said, "Molly's afraid to come in here. She thinks something's going to get her." Mr. Simmons looked up and smiled at me. "Well, good morning, Molly. Won't you join us?" Taking a deep breath, I walked toward him, careful, as usual, not to step on anybody's grave. Now that the grass was cut, it was easier to see where it was safe to walk. In fact, the whole place looked a lot less scary than it had before. "Mr. Simmons says this is a real old graveyard," Michael told me. "The church was built way back in 1825, so some of the graves are 160 years old. Isn't that something? The Civil War hadn't even happened then. But nobody's been buried here since 1950. Isn't that right?" Michael turned to Mr. Simmons. The old man nodded his head. "They filled the graveyard up. That's what they did. Old Mrs. Perkins was the last one to get in." He pointed at a pink stone with a shiny front. "Right there she is, my first-grade teacher." He grinned and shook his head. "She's not handing out any report cards now, is she?" Michael laughed, but I felt sad just thinking about Mrs. Perkins. "Caroline," it said on the stone, "dear departed wife of John Albert Perkins. She will long be missed." "And right over here," Mr. Simmons went on, "is where my mother and father are sleeping." He rested his old hands on two stones. "I brought flowers for them and my baby sister, too." I looked at the mason jars full of wildflowers decorating the three graves. "They look very pretty," I said, wondering if he felt sad. "It must be awful when a baby dies," I added, staring at the tiny headstone marking his sister's grave. "They didn't have the medicine then, you know," he said. "Measles, chicken pox, whooping cough, scarlet fever. That's what killed the children." As Michael nodded, glad that Mr. Simmons was backing up his own theories, Heather joined us. Fire, too, she said. Lots of people die in fires, didn't they? Mr. Simmons looked a little surprised. They did indeed, he said. My mother died in a fire. Heather dropped a dandelion on the baby's grave and walked away. Mr. Simmons watched her for a moment, then turned to us. I thought she was your sister, he said. No, her father married our mother. Michael nudged the dandelions away from the baby's grave with his bare toe. She's our stepsister. Her mother died in a fire? Mr. Simmons asked. When Heather was 3, they were all alone in the house, and Heather almost died too. She was unconscious when the rescue squad found her, I told him. Poor little thing, he said sympathetically. Turning away, he returned to his work, clipping carefully around each stone and whistling. The sweet smell of cut grass drying in the hot sun filled the air, mingling with the aroma of Mr. Simmons' pipe. A mockingbird perched on a tombstone and sang. Butterflies flashed about, and for a while I forgot my fears and helped Michael scoop the grass cuttings into the wheelbarrow. You haven't mowed under the tree, I heard Heather say suddenly. She was frowning at Mr. Simmons' back as he knelt at the base of the Barry's marble angel. He squinted up at her. Not enough grass under that old tree to bother with, he said pleasantly. There's weeds, though. I just tend to the tombstones. Mr. Simmons returned his attention to the grass, but Heather didn't take the hint. But there's a grave there, she said, her lip jutting out. I saw it. Mr. Simmons straightened up and stared at her. Couldn't be. Too many roots to bury somebody there. The tombstone is lying down in the weeds, Heather insisted. Come with me. I'll show you. She started walking toward the dense shade under the oak tree, and Mr. Simmons shrugged and followed her. Michael turned to me. Aren't you coming with us, Molly? I started to go with them, but I felt my goosebumps coming back. The cheerfulness of the day was gone, as surely as if a cloud had covered the sun. Something was wrong. I could sense it if no one else could. Staying where I was, next to the relative safety of Mrs. Perkins' shiny new tombstone, I watched the 3 of them step into the oak tree's shadow. Heather pointed at something in the grass, and Mr. Simmons bent down to get a better look. Looks like you're right, I heard him say to Heather. Come here, Molly, Michael called. This is really interesting. As Heather smiled at me over her shoulder, daring me as she had before, I forced myself to join them. Mr. Simmons was struggling to right a small, weather-stained stone. Well, I'll be, he said. I've been tending these graves for 20-some years, and I never knew this one was here. Never even looked for it. With the stone erect, he scraped away the dirt and moss to reveal the inscription, H.E.H., he read out loud, tracing the letters with his fingers. March 7th, 1879 to August 8th, 1886. May she rest in peace. He shook his head and set to work pulling out the weeds growing around the base of the stone. Strange, isn't it? Why is it strange? Michael asked. Well, she was just a child, 7 years old. Where's the rest of the family? What do you mean? Michael squatted beside him, staring at the gravestone. Well, look around, son. Families get buried together, he said. That's right, like the berry patch. Michael nodded astutely. Mr. Simmons looked puzzled for a moment, but then he chuckled. Yes, the Berry family. All together they are, with their very own angel to watch over them. He relit his pipe and stood up, gazing about the graveyard. The stones usually say, beloved daughter of, or something like that, he mused. But here's this child, all by herself. No name, just the initials. No other grave close by. It just doesn't seem right somehow." "It's my initials," Heather said suddenly, removing her thumb from her mouth and touching the stone lightly. "Heather Elizabeth Hill. My age, too," she added, as we all stared at her. "Well, now that is a coincidence," Mr. Simmons said. Lopping away the last of the weeds, he took Heather's hand and led her out into the sunlight. "I wouldn't play here," he said to her. "Even with the weeds gone, it's a good place for snakes. Poison ivy, too, from the looks of it." He gestured at the shiny green leaves flourishing the shade and twisting up the oak's trunk. "I'm not afraid of snakes," Heather said, "or poison ivy either. I never get it." Mr. Simmons frowned down at her. "You listen to what I tell you, young lady. That's the kind of shade a copperhead loves. One of them bites you, you'll know it." Heather gave the old man a scornful look and pulled away from him. "I'll play wherever I want to. You're not my boss." Then she stalked off, head high, black curls lifting in the breeze. "Uppity little creature," Mr. Simmons said. "How about giving me a hand with the wheelbarrow?" he asked Michael. As the two of them trundled off toward the compost heap, I walked back to the house. Although Heather was nowhere in sight, I could hear Dave's voice in the carriage house, and I suppose she'd gone in there to tell him how mean Mr. Simmons was. Finding a shady spot on the back steps, I sat down and gazed across the yard at the oak tree standing guard over H.E.H.'s lonely grave. Why hadn't the child's name been carved on the tombstone? Why was it all alone? I shivered again, despite the heat, and wondered how I would feel if the initials had been mine instead of Heather's.